hadn't started yet.
So they're holding the start, right?
I think they're holding until the end. Their plan is...
Mark Pietskowski?
Huh?
They're going to tow Mark out?
No, their transmission is dead.
Okay.
What they're trying to do is start the stage, and then they're going to get the crew to tow them all the way out. But they don't want to block the road.
I see what they're doing. Okay, fine.
Okay.
Okay, great.
You.
Thanks.
Yep. 450. Okay, yep.